Hi everybody! This video is going to go over the final paper for English 330. So for this final paper, you're going to compose a 5 to 6 page paper about Kindred, Never Let Me Go, or American Born Chinese. And this paper should make a clear interpretive argument about the novel or graphic novel. The central argument should be expressed in a clear and specific thesis. And each of your body paragraphs should present evidence, such as examples and quotations from the novel, that explain how the evidence supports your thesis. And I have a handout on Blackboard that talks about organizing paragraphs in literary analysis papers that you're welcome to look at if you want an example of what I'm talking about. And if you want to reach out to me over email to run a thesis by me, I'm happy to give you feedback on it. I'm also happy to set up a meeting to talk about your ideas for your paper in more depth, if you'd like to do that as well. And then in addition to these requirements for the paper, you will also need to integrate a minimum of 2 scholarly secondary sources into your paper. And there's a handout on Blackboard about secondary sources and some examples about how to use them in your paper. So I recommend that you take a look at that, especially if it's been a while since you've written a paper that uses secondary sources, or if using secondary sources is something that's new to you. And again, if you have more specific questions, I'm happy to set up a meeting to talk about this with you. Okay, so for this paper, I'm going to encourage you to choose one of the following prompts as a starting point for your essay, and I'll go over each of these prompts in more detail. For each of these prompts, you do not need to answer every single question that's posed in the prompts. These are questions that are designed to help you focus and refine your thesis, but they're not necessarily meant to sort of box you in to a particular topic or a particular perspective on the novel or the graphic novel. And if you'd like to write on a different topic, you're welcome to reach out to me to talk about the ideas. I do encourage you to run your ideas by me ahead of time because there's a possibility that I may penalize your paper if you don't run it by me, because it might not be making the kind of argument that I'm looking for this particular assignment and for this particular class. And finally, you are welcome to draw on journals, discussion posts, or the secondary source assignment when you're writing your essay. I want you to be drawing on all the ideas that you've been developing and thinking about over the course of the semester. However, if you do this, I encourage you to remember that I want you to keep developing and keep expanding on these points and not necessarily just copying and pasting what you've already written. Because if you do that, it's probably not going to be very well integrated into your paper. Okay, so now I'm going to go over the prompts for each of the novels in the graphic novel. So I have 3 potential prompts for Kindred. The first thinks about, or encourages you to think about, Octavia Butler's representation of sort of slaves and slavery. So Octavia Butler wrote Kindred in part to challenge stereotypes of submissive slaves and slaves who did not seek to escape to the North. What specific stereotypes does it challenge, and how does it dispute them? And as I say here, if you choose this prompt, you may want to focus on Butler's depiction of some specific characters. So if I were writing on this paper, I would probably talk a lot about the character of Sarah, and maybe also the character of Alice, and maybe also the character of Dana as well. These are all, characters that sort of complicate some sort of notions of slavery that people may have had. The second question asked you to think about the role of history and the depiction of history in the novel. In an interview, Octavia Butler once said, quote, "I wanted to write a novel that would make others feel the history, the pain, the fear that Black people have had to live through in order to endure," end quote. What problems with traditional histories of slavery does Kindred highlight? How does it fill in these gaps in the historical record? How does it encourage readers to feel history? And so this is something that we've talked a little bit about in discussions. So if this is something you're interested in writing about, you could definitely go back to some of our past discussions about how history is presented, and specifically our discussion about some of the points that are presented in Gregory Hampton's article. Those would always all be sort of good starting points for writing on this topic. And then the last question that I gave you has to do with the significance of Dana's lost arm. Kindred opens with Dana, the narrator, revealing that she lost an arm on her last trip home. Write a paper that makes an argument about the larger significance of her lost arm. And I leave this open-ended in part because I think there's a lot of different directions this could go. And this is something that we also talked a little bit about in discussion with Kindred, so you could definitely go back to that and review some of those points that we made. If I was writing on this, I would probably link this to the sort of historical significance of slavery and how the sort of legacy of slavery in some ways is still present in the United States. And how, when Dana comes back, even if though she's sort of theoretically escaped slavery, she still has to sort of deal with that trauma and deal with that experience in her daily life. That's what I would talk about, but I think there's room to talk about other things as well. And so if you want to talk more about that, I'm also willing to talk with you about that in a meeting. Okay, I also have 3 different prompts for the novel Never Let Me Go. And the first has to do with memory. So write a paper that makes an argument about the significance of memory within Never Let Me Go. What memories does Kathy H. try to hold on to? Why do these memories seem to be important to her and the other characters? So memory is a topic that we talked a lot about in discussion, and that the article that we read also talks a lot about. So if you're wanting to talk about this topic, I encourage you to go back and maybe look at some of those discussions that we had and take a second look at that article. The second question has to do with kind of the world of Never Let Me Go and those more sort of dystopian elements. So most clones in the world of Never Let Me Go seem to accept their destiny as organ donors. Why do you think they accept their fates? What methods, including the language around the donation process, are used to encourage them to accept and even embrace this grisly future? If you wish, you may also discuss how these methods are similar to tactics used to encourage people to accept unpleasant situations or destinies in our own world. So this is basically a prompt that asks you to think more about this question about why don't the clones rebel? Why do they accept this sort of awful thing that is happening to them? And if you want, and you don't have to do this, but if you want, make connections to our own experience. And there is an article that I will be putting on Blackboard that talks a lot about this as well. And so it's about, I think, it's called Caring as a Gift, and it's by Rollins, I think. So so if you're interested in this topic, you should definitely take a look at that because it addresses this directly. And then the last prompt is near the end of Never Let Me Go. Miss Emily reveals that she and Miss Lucy disagreed about how to prepare Hailsham students for the future. Miss Emily, along with Madame, believed that students should be sheltered from the truth, and Miss Lucy believed that they should be given as full a picture as possible. So choose a side in this argument and write a paper that defends it using the novel as evidence. So this is basically a prompt that asks you to think more about this question that Tommy and I think Kathy actually disagree on as well. And think about, now that you've sort of seen events, at least from Kathy's perspective, what do you think about this issue? And what about Kathy's experience? And what about Tommy's experience makes you sort of feel that either Miss Lucy was right or that Madame was right? And if you do focus on this prompt, again, I strongly encourage you to, again, think about like what's happening within the novel. So, if you believe along with Miss Emily and Madame, the students should be sheltered from the truth, what is it that's so great about Hailsham? What is it that's so great about this experience? And why does it seem so important to them? What's the value in this experience that they had? And if you agree sort of more with Tommy, what is it about the experience that they had that seems sort of tragic? And how could maybe that have sort of been avoided if someone like something happened that was closer to what sort of Miss Lucy was looking for? So I hope that makes sense. And I'm certainly willing to clarify that and to talk through it with you if you want. And then finally, I also have 2 prompts that you can write on for American-born Chinese if you like. This first one has to do with the article that we're reading for American-born Chinese. So in her article on American-born Chinese, Min Yong Song suggests that the graphic novel is a parable of racial microaggressions. Write a paper that explains how the narrative of the Monkey King, the narrative of Danny/Jin, and/or the narrative of Wei Chen reflect Asian Americans and other minority groups' experience in the United States. How are these characters subtly excluded from some spaces and communities? How do they reshape themselves in order to be accepted into these spaces and communities? So this is essentially asking you, to think more about this claim that song makes, and think about how these different narratives that all come together reflect the sort of experience of Asian Americans or possibly other minorities' experiences in the United States. And you don't necessarily have to talk about the Monkey King, Danny Jin, and Wei Chen. You can certainly choose one or two of those narratives to focus on. And then the last question has to do with the character of Qin Ki in American Born Chinese. One of the central characters of American Born Chinese is Qin Ki, an amalgamation of racist stereotypes of Chinese people who is eventually revealed as the Monkey King in disguise. Why do you think Yang includes such racist characters in the graphic novel? How exactly does the Monkey King serve as Jin/Danny's conscience? And what does this function in a narrative about Chinese American identity? So this question basically asks you to think more about Qin Ki, about what role he plays in the novel, and about what it is that he does for Jin/Danny, and then finally how this also relates to the sort of broader issue of Chinese American identity. So these are two possible prompts. If you have other things that you find interesting or you'd like to write on in American Born Chinese or the other two novels that we've read, feel free to run those by me as well. So I'm open to other ideas. These are just starting points that you can use if you're having trouble getting started. Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about this other part of the paper, which is secondary sources. So as I said earlier, this paper requires you to integrate a minimum of 2 scholarly secondary sources into your paper. And keep in mind that a scholarly source is an article from an academic journal, not a newspaper or magazine or an academic book. So I've put some resources on Blackboard to help you find sources. I've put some articles and some links to articles on Kindred and Never Let Me Go and also American Born Chinese, although I need to change the slideshow to say that. I've put a link to a library research guide, which links to some databases that you can use to find your own sources. And I've also put in a video that kind of walks you through using the MLA International Bibliography, which is one of the databases that you can use to find scholarly secondary sources. So these are some resources that I've put on Blackboard that you can use to help find some sources. And then finally, I will go over the paper guidelines. So this paper should be 5 to 6 full pages, not 4.5 pages, and that does not include the works cited page. So it should be a minimum of 5 full pages plus a works cited page. It should follow MLA style formatting. So this means it should be typed in 12-point Times New Roman font. It should be double spaced. It should have 1-inch margins on each side. It should have the page number and your last name in the top right corner. And the first page should have a heading. So it should have your name, your full name, the instructor's name, that's my name, the class, and the date in that top left corner of the first page. And then also you should have a works cited page that includes the citations for all sources. So this includes the articles that you discuss and the novel, so both the primary and the secondary sources. And once again, I will say this works cited page does not count towards the page minimum. And then your quotations should be properly formatted and documented. So this means you need to parenthetically cite the page number of quotations, and there is a handout on Blackboard that shows you how to do this. Your paper should also be well organized, and generally speaking, this means it should have a short introduction. Usually that means around 5 to 7 sentences that briefly contextualizes the topic. So sort of introduces your topic, shows why it's important, and then presents your thesis, or that sort of summary of your argument. It should have several body paragraphs that develop your thesis. And each body paragraph should have a clear point, and all the sentences in the paragraph should either explain that point or support that point. And then finally, it should have a short conclusion, again, around 5 to 7 sentences, that sums up your argument and highlights the significance. And then to submit the paper, you'll find the submission area for it in the Dropbox. You'll find the submission area for it in the week 16 folder on Blackboard, and it's going to be due on 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, December 8th. So that's at the end of the very last week of class. And please do reach out to me if you have questions about this paper or if you want to run your ideas by me. And unless I hear from you, I am looking forward and excited to see what you have to say about either Kindred, Never Let Me Go, or American Born Chinese.